Spring, 1946. The dust hadn't settled from a world at war. For a group of Japanese female POWs, moved from a camp in California, this was supposed to be another prison. They braced for more barbed wire, more hatred in the eyes of their guards. Instead, the world opened up, endless, and bleached by the Sunday, and there stood men who were supposed to be monsters, Texas cowboys, tipping their hats in greeting. They couldn't believe it when these cowboys invited them to their ranches. But that first night, a single bullet casing left on a pillow delivered a silent warning. This wasn't peace. It was just a different kind of battlefield. These stories of unexpected humanity deserve to be heard. If you agree, and you want to discover more incredible stories that history almost forgot, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories can travel. Aiko Nakamura had learned the language of walls, concrete, wood, barbed wire. They all whispered the same word: end. The end of a country, the end of a life, the end of hope. When the American soldiers told them they were going to Texas, she and the other nurses from the Manila camp simply nodded. It was just a new name for the same wall. The train ride was a blur of grey landscapes seen through dirty glass, a numbing continuation of their slow fade from the world. But when the bus shuddered to a stop and the doors hissed open, there was no wall. There was only sky, a dizzying, impossible blue that stretched from one end of the world to the other. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and something warm, like baked earth. Before them stood not a camp but a ranch house, painted white and weathered by a sun she had never felt. And the guards were not soldiers with rifles, but men in worn jeans and dusty boots who watched them descend with a quiet, unreadable curiosity. One of them, a man with a jaw set like stone and eyes that held the ghosts of the Pacific, stood apart from the others. He didn't look at them as women, or even prisoners. He looked at them like a storm he hadn't accounted for. Martha Lee, the ranch widow, met them with a pitcher of lemonade and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her own son was buried somewhere under the Pacific's indifferent sky, a fact that sat between her and these women like a ghost at the dinner table. Yet she was a woman whose faith was bigger than her grief. "They're just girls," she told her foreman, Tom Carter, later that evening as they watched the Japanese women move into the bunkhouse with silent, disciplined efficiency. Tom just grunted, polishing a saddle buckle with more force than necessary. He'd seen what their men had done on Saipan. He saw the same quiet obedience in these women, and it unnerved him. To him, they were not just girls. They were the enemy, breathing his air, sleeping under his roof. The first few days were a fragile truce. The Japanese nurses, led by Aiko's silent example, worked without complaint, their hands, once skilled with sutures and bandages, now mending fences and hauling water. Aiko refused all but the plainest food, rice and water, building a small private fortress of resistance within herself. She worked with a focus that was both admirable and chilling, her face a smooth, unreadable mask. She was present in body, but her spirit remained captive thousands of miles away. Martha tried to break through with small kindnesses, a freshly laundered blanket, a wild prairie flower left on a windowsill. The women would bow, their gratitude as formal and distant as a treaty. Tom watched it all, his suspicion a hard knot in his gut. He was waiting for the trick. The deception he knew was there. Then the sky turned on them. One afternoon, the horizon vanished, consumed by a roiling wall of brown dust. The wind screamed, a high, thin wail that ripped at the shingles on the barn. The world shrank to a churning vortex of grit and chaos. The cattle, spooked by the sudden darkness, began to break from the herd, their panicked bellows lost in the storm's roar. Tom and the other hands fought to regain control, blinded and choked by the sand. In the mayhem, a young calf, separated from its mother, stumbled into a wire fence, its leg twisting at an unnatural angle. The animal cried out, a sound of pure terror. While the others ran for cover or fought the larger herd, Aiko moved toward the sound. The instinct was too deep to be denied. A wounded creature needed her. Tom saw her through the blinding dust, a small, determined figure moving against the wind. She reached the calf, speaking to it in low, soothing tones, a language of mercy that needed no translation. Her hands, so steady and sure, assessed the wound. With no medical supplies, she improvised. Tearing a long strip from the hem of her own worn dress, she braced the broken leg with a fallen branch and began to wrap it, her movements clean and economical. Tom stopped, the rope in his hand going slack. He stood frozen, watching her. He had seen hands like that before. In field hospitals, slick with blood, working with the same desperate precision to save a screaming Marine. In that moment, the dust storm settled something inside him. The uniform she had once worn, the flag she had served, the war that had forged his hatred. It all blew away like chaff in the wind. He saw not a Jap, not an enemy, but a healer. A woman kneeling in the dirt, comforting a frightened animal, her face etched with a familiar, weary compassion. The calf, calmed by her touch, quieted. The wind began to die down. For a long, silent moment, their eyes met across the dusty expanse, a flicker of shared humanity, as fragile and unexpected as a bloom in the desert. That evening, the air was still and clean, the sky washed in the gentle colors of a Texas sunset. A quiet understanding seemed to have settled over the ranch. But when Aiko returned to the bunkhouse and smoothed the thin blanket on her cot, her fingers brushed against something small, hard, and cold. Lying in the center of her pillow was a single, spent bullet casing. It gleamed dully in the fading light, a stark brass message. Someone had seen that moment of connection, and someone wanted it to be the last. Aiko picked it up. The ranch had no barbed wire, but she understood now. Texas wasn't a reprieve. It was just a new front on an old war. A battlefield not of nations, but of hearts. The bullet casing stayed, tucked in the small cloth pouch Aiko used for her sewing needles. A cold reminder that rattled against her thimble with every move. But outside the bunkhouse, a fragile rhythm began to take hold, paced by the rise and fall of the Texas Sunday. Days were measured in the steady work of mending fences, their hands finding a familiar precision in tying wire instead of stitches. They learned the weight of a water bucket, the scent of hay in the barn, the satisfying ache in their muscles at dusk. Small kindnesses began to bridge the chasm of silence. Hannah, the youngest of the nurses, would often sit with Martha's grandchildren, her nimble fingers folding paper into cranes and frogs, her soft laughter a language the children understood perfectly. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, a task that reminded her of the hospital grounds in another lifetime, Aiko began to hum. It was an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a tune of cherry blossoms and the sea. The melody was a secret comfort, a piece of home she carried inside her. Standing nearby, pinning a sheet to the line, Martha Lee paused. She didn't recognize the words, but she knew the sound of a heart trying to soothe itself. She turned, a soft smile on her face, and began to hum along, her voice a low, gentle counterpoint to Aiko's. For a moment, they stood there, two mothers from opposite ends of a broken world, sharing a song only one of them knew. Tom watched these small moments from a distance, the hard knot of his anger slowly, painfully, beginning to unravel. The woman who had knelt in the dust to save his calf was not the monster from his nightmares. He saw her patience, her quiet dignity, the way her eyes would follow the flight of a hawk against the vast sky. One morning, he found her watching the ranch hands work the horses. He approached, leading a gentle mare by the reins. He gestured toward the saddle, a question in his eyes. Aiko hesitated, then gave a small, uncertain nod. The lesson was clumsy, a mix of awkward gestures, and a few broken English words he taught her. Heels down, hold tight. When the horse took a sudden step, she let out a small gasp and grabbed his arm for balance. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived, Aiko laughed. It was a soft, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even her. Tom found himself smiling back, a genuine smile that felt foreign on his own face. In that shared moment of simple human clumsiness, a piece of the wall between them crumbled into dust. But the town of San Amaro had built its walls high. On Sunday, when Martha entered the church, a neighbor stopped her in the aisle, her face tight with disapproval. "Martha, you're feeding the enemy in your own home," the woman hissed, her whisper carrying through the pews like a snake through dry grass. A few days later, the whispers became a headline. The local newspaper ran a photograph of the women working in the fields, their faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats Martha had given them. The caption underneath was a brand: "Cowboys turn camp into hotel for Japs." The article was filled with fear and suspicion, painting the women as a threat, their presence an insult to every local boy who had fought and died. The pressure from the town was a physical weight, pressing in on the fragile piece of the Carter Ranch. Martha decided the best response was not to hide, but to invite the town in. She planned a 4th of July picnic, a gesture of goodwill meant to show everyone that the women were not a threat. It was a disaster from the start. The townsfolk who came stood in tight, suspicious clusters, their polite smiles never reaching their eyes. The Japanese women, sensing the hostility, stayed near the bunkhouse, their silence a stark contrast to the forced gaiety. As dusk fell and someone set off a string of firecrackers, a stray spark drifted on the wind. It landed in the dry hay piled high in the open barn. The fire exploded. Flames devoured the old, dry timber, roaring toward the sky in a terrifying pillar of orange and black. Panic erupted. People screamed and ran. The horses, trapped in their stalls, whinnied in terror. While the men scrambled for water buckets, Aiko and the other nurses ran toward the danger. They moved as one, their training kicking in, their faces set with a grim determination that silenced the chaos around them. They were no longer prisoners. They were healers, running toward the suffering. Aiko ripped open a stall door, choking on the thick smoke, as she worked to calm a terrified horse, its eyes wide with fear. As she led the animal out, a burning beam crashed from the loft above. Tom saw it fall. He didn't think. He just moved. He lunged forward, shoving her clear as the flaming wood rained down. He felt a searing pain as his own arm brushed against a stray ember, but he ignored it. His only thought was of Aiko, safe on the ground, coughing but unhurt. He pulled her to her feet, his hand on her arm, the shared terror forging a bond stronger than steel. Later that night, the barn was a smoldering ruin. The picnic was over, but under the stars, a different kind of gathering took place. By the light of a single lantern, Martha, Tom, Aiko, and the other women shared what was left of the food, charred cornbread and lukewarm coffee. The silence was no longer tense, but filled with a shared, exhausted respect. The townsfolk were gone, and in their absence, the truth remained. It was Tom who finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at Aiko, his bandaged hand resting on the table between them. "All that time on the islands," he said, his voice low. "I thought you people were monsters." He looked down, ashamed of the words, but needing to say them. Aiko met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the lantern's soft light. She gave a slow, sad nod. "So did I," she answered quietly. The scorched earth where the barn had stood was a daily reminder of both loss and salvation. A quiet had settled over the ranch, the kind that follows a fever, leaving everything both weary and strangely clear. It was in this quiet that the mail arrived. A thin, official-looking envelope was handed to Aiko, a letter forwarded from the main camp in California. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she opened it. The words blurred, then sharpened into a single, impossible truth. Her younger brother, Kenji, presumed lost with the Navy, was alive. He was working as a laborer in the ruins of Yokohama. The relief that washed over her was so immense it almost brought her to her knees. She had thought she was the last of her family, a solitary ghost haunting a foreign land. And now, there was a lifeline. She had to write to him. She had to tell him she was safe, that she was alive. But as the desperate need to connect surged through her, it crashed against the hard reality of her situation. A letter to Japan required postage, money she did not have and had no way of earning. The joy that had filled her heart moments before receded, leaving an ache that was sharper than any grief she had yet endured. To be so close to hope, only to have it be out of reach, was a unique cruelty of this new world. Martha saw the change in Aiko that afternoon. The younger woman moved through her chores with a distracted air, her eyes distant, her face shadowed with a new, private sorrow. Martha didn't ask. She had learned that Aiko's grief was a private country, and one did not cross its borders uninvited. But she watched. She saw Aiko tracing Japanese characters in the dust with a stick, then wiping them away with her foot. She saw her staring at the horizon, as if she could will her thoughts across the ocean. That evening, Martha walked to the tack room, the air thick with the smell of leather and old memories. She ran a hand over a dusty saddle propped in the corner. It was her husband's, the one he'd used for 30 years. The leather was worn smooth in the seat, scarred with the history of their life together. It was the last thing of his she had, that truly held the shape of him. The next morning, she rode into town, the saddle tied behind her. When she returned, she found Aiko sitting alone on the steps of the bunkhouse. Martha simply held out her hand. In her palm lay a few coins and a small stack of crisp postage stamps. Aiko stared at the offering, confused. Martha's gaze was gentle but firm. "For your letter," she said softly. Understanding dawned, and with it, a wave of emotion so powerful it stole Aiko's breath. This was more than money. This was a piece of a life, a memory, sacrificed for her, for an enemy. For years, Aiko had held her pain inside, building a wall of disciplined silence around her heart. But this simple act of unearned mercy was a force her defenses could not withstand. The wall broke. A sob tore from her throat, and for the first time since the bombs fell on Manila, Aiko Nakamura wept. She cried for her brother, for her lost family, for the years of fear and uncertainty, and she cried for the staggering, impossible kindness of a woman who should have been her enemy. Martha didn't say a word. She just sat down beside her, a quiet, solid presence until the storm passed. That night, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, Aiko wrote. The words flowed onto the page, a torrent of love and relief. She told Kenji about Texas, about the vastness of the sky and the surprising warmth of the Sunday. She told him about the fire, about the angry words in the newspaper. But she also wrote about Martha. She wrote about a shared song over a laundry line and a kindness that had cost more than money. The letter was a story of survival, but more than that, it was a testament to the idea that peace was not something declared by governments, but something built, person by person, in small, sacred moments. When she took the letter to the post office in San Amaro, the postmaster, a man whose own nephew had been a prisoner in the Philippines, handled it with suspicion. But later, alone in the back room, his curiosity got the better of him. He carefully steamed it open. He expected to find codes, or complaints, or hatred. Instead, he found a sister's love and a quiet prayer for mercy to bloom in the wasteland of war. He was a church-going man, and the words on the thin paper felt more like a sermon than any he'd heard from a pulpit. He sealed the letter and sent it on its way, but he didn't forget what he'd read. He told his wife, who told her sister, and a quiet story of the Japanese nurse, and her letter to her lost brother began to circulate, a gentle current pushing against the tide of fear. But the tide was strong. One morning, just as the sun was rising, Tom Carter walked out to the half-rebuilt barn and stopped cold. Scrawled across the fresh pine in angry, black paint were 2 words: go home. The message was a raw wound, a brutal rejection of the fragile peace they had begun to build. The air grew thick with a familiar tension. Later that day, a government car rumbled up the drive, kicking up a plume of dust. Captain Howard Briggs stepped out, his uniform crisp, his face impassive. He carried a briefcase and an air of finality. The pilot program, he announced without ceremony, was being terminated. Public sentiment and reports of local unrest had made it untenable. The women were to be packed and ready for transport back to the California camp by the end of the week. The decision was absolute. There was no appeal. Aiko stood with the other women, listening to the captain's bureaucratic decree. She looked from Tom's stone-faced fury to Martha's quiet heartbreak, and then to the hateful words burned onto the barn. The letter was on its way to Japan, a vessel of hope sailing across the world. But here in Texas, their own small hope had just been extinguished.